Good morning, everyone. My name is Kate Nielsen, and I'm the Education Lead for BC Nonprofit Housing Association, and I'll be your opening and closing moderator today. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar called Staying Emotionally Healthy During the COVID-19 Pandemic, facilitated by Dr. Ross Laird. This webinar is presented by BC NPHA in partnership with Ross Laird. Dr. Ross Laird is a best-selling author and award-winning clinical consultant in mental health and trauma. He's worked extensively for frontline and non-professional professionals over more than 30 years of practice and has presented numerous times at the Housing Central Conference. Dr. Laird is the clinical supervisor for BC's largest licensed program in addictions and mental health and is a clinical consultant for many organizations in social services, healthcare, and education. And you can visit rosslaird.com for more information. Now over to you, Ross.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start with a little summary and overview about human resilience and move into questions of how we get challenged in the current situation, what we might do, how we might move forward. I'm going to be taking a break about halfway through the slide deck so that we'll have a chance to do some self-reflection, perhaps have a little conversation. At the end, we'll also have some time to have some further discussion about the issues at hand. We all recognize that this is a very complex situation and it's an ever-evolving landscape of new circumstances that we have to face. So today, what I'd like to do is to explore how we might make our way through this so that we recognize that there's a kind of normal set of reactions to this for our society, that what we do is typical for humans, how our coping might be for ourselves in a situation like this, what kinds of things do we do that help us or that might get in our way, how we might think about building skill. What does personal skill look like here for the workplace, for our residents or our clients? What kinds of help are best in a situation like this? What things should we perhaps avoid or emphasize? And then what does health look like for the community, for society, for the long run? How do we make sure that we notice what we should notice in this situation, that we integrate our own personal process with the work of our colleagues and our clients and our residents, and how do we make this work for everyone? You know, humans have a long history of resilience through very difficult circumstances, including pandemics. We have millions of years of evolution behind us, and we're pretty good at getting through stuff. So today I want to kind of hold that note of positivity while also looking at what are some of the challenges and how we might make our way through them. Okay, so let's look at the first thing, which is what are the normal human responses to a situation like this? What are the normal human stress responses that have evolved, as I said, over millions of years? We tend to do one of four things when we get stressed out, right? We tend to flee and get dissociated or distracted. We tend to freeze and kind of shut down inside a little bit and just hope the whole thing will go away. Or we tend to get hypervigilant and we do lots of orienting and thinking and we get that racing mind and we're not really sure what to do. We don't really do anything. We're kind of stuck in this anxious place. Or we get angry. We fight back against the system. We fight back against our colleagues, ourselves, our families. And these four normal human responses, they're kind of baked into us by way of our evolution. We have learned over millions of years to respond to the different kinds of situations, stressful situations that we face as humans in one of these four ways. And different situations call on us to use one of these four to get through. Sometimes the right response for us is to fight back. And sometimes the right response for us is to shut down and wait. Sometimes it's to get anxious and figure out a pathway. And sometimes it's just to wait and kind of dissociate and hope the whole thing will pass over. So we have deep resources inside of us for dealing with exactly this kind of situation. And I want us to remember that through the whole presentation and discussion here today. We have deep resources, untapped resources for most of us. We're living in an age, a modern age, which is very developed in terms of its ability to buffer the stresses that our ancestors dealt with on a daily basis. And so we don't often um, uh, find ourselves in situations where we have to deal with deep stress. Some of us do, but many of us are buffered. And so our ability to call upon these resources is not impaired exactly, but we forget sometimes. We forget how resilient we are. So all of these systems, all of these coping mechanisms are deep inside of us, and we can call upon them anytime. And when we do call upon them, this is what we tend to do. If we call upon the flight response, if that's our habit, then we'll tend to do these kinds of things in this list here. We'll get distracted, or we'll get dissociated, or we avoid things, or we deny, or we withdraw, or we retreat. The system that we use to enable our ability to get out of the world, to get distracted, and to just retreat from everything is a deep impulse to go elsewhere, to go into the spirit world, or to go into our imagination, or to go to somewhere else and just kind of hunker down. Now, each of the four responses that I mentioned is the kind of thing that we tend to fall into as a habit because of the way that we've grown up as people, because of the way our childhood development was. So as I go through each of these four, there's a card for each one of these. As I go through them, I encourage you to just think about yourself. What is it that you do, right? What is it that you do when you get stressed out? Because you always do the same thing. I always do the same thing when I get stressed out. Everybody has a habit. Some people just want to retreat and get away from it. Those are the people whose habit is the flight response. Some people just freeze. They go slow, they shut down, they get really tired. They want to sleep the whole thing away. They hope that if they go to sleep long enough, when they wake up, the situation will have resolved itself. They get overwhelmed, they get emotionally, I don't know, a little bit fragile maybe, and they just kind of curl inward. If that's your thing, then what you'll be feeling right now in this situation during this pandemic is a lot of fatigue. You'll just be feeling really tired. You're going to want to sleep all the time, and it's going to be a struggle just to get out the door. Or maybe your thing is anxiety. Maybe your thing is that you orient, that you get hypervigilant. You try to figure out all the details. You try to figure out how you can get through safely by doing more. The person who freezes tends to do less. The person who orients tends to do more. They get anxious, they can't sleep, they get kind of fragmented thoughts, racing thoughts. They can't stop thinking about it. If you're the kind of person who binge watches news about the pandemic, this is probably your deal. If you get stuck in that endless loop of checking, impulsively, compulsively checking the news cycle, and just trying to stay up to date with every tiny little thing that happens around us in this situation, then orienting's probably your thing. And anxiety's probably going to be the likely thing that you experience emotionally. You just want to keep kind of going on, keep moving forward. Or maybe your thing is that you're just angry and you want to fight back against this. You feel that this is unfair. You feel that if you fight hard enough, you can control it. And if that's your thing, then the tendency is to want to get out in front of it, to focus on yourself and the people around you and how you might control the situation. Now, of course, this is not a controllable situation. It's global and everyone is struggling. So if fighting is your thing, if it's the thing you've learned to do, well, a couple of things about that. One is you're more likely to be a person in a position of responsibility for other people. Maybe you're a manager or an executive director or somebody like that. Those people with the fight response as their default stress system, they tend to end up in positions of authority and responsibility. So before we move on, just take a look at these four and ask yourself, what's my tendency? Of course, we have all of these inside of us, every single one. And depending on the circumstance, we might do one or the other. But when stress hits us, especially when stress hits us in the long run, then we tend to do one thing only. It's the thing that we learned to do as a kid when things got tough and it got kind of fixed into the system, the nervous system, the neurobiological, neurochemical system. And here we are. This is what we do during stress. So notice yourself. When we get to the question period and the discussion period, we'll talk more about these default nervous system responses, but I want you to kind of think about it for a second to be aware of what's yours, what's your brand. Okay, so these are the normal responses, and they lead to normal coping patterns. So the four coping patterns, retreat, depression, anxiety, and anger, flow naturally from the default nervous system patterns, right? The impulse to get away, to retreat, the impulse to curl up and go to sleep, which can lead to depression over time. The impulse to be hypervigilant can lead to anxiety over time. And the impulse to fight leads to this often pressing anger. So these are the four normal coping patterns. This is what we do, right? We try to get away from the thing. We try to escape into fantasy and spirituality and ritual and the imagination. If you're a reader, if your impulse during this pandemic is to catch up on all the hundreds of books, the hundreds of fantasy literature books or sci-fi books that you have been wanting to get to, then this is probably your thing. If you find storytelling as a refuge, if you can escape into imaginal worlds, then this is probably your thing. Maybe it's something else though. Maybe what you do is you slide into depression. And we're seeing a lot of depression right now. So let's broaden the frame or the perspective here beyond ourselves for a moment and think about all the people around us who are depressed. It's an accelerating situation here. And as the pandemic continues, there's likely to be a kind of nervous system fatigue where people's ability to kind of keep themselves moving by way of their default responses leads to a kind of fatigue of those default responses, so that they tend to settle in and we get stuck inside of them. And that's the downside I'll talk about a bit later. But for now, just think about all the people you see around you, and maybe yourself and your family members or your colleagues. Think about all the people who are binge watching TV, so retreating into the imagination, or binge reading, and think about all the people who are depressed, all the people who are going quiet, who are going home, trying to stay away from everything, who are just overwhelmed and they've just kind of collapsed into themselves. And then of course there's the anxious folks, the people who are not sure what to do. Nobody's really sure what to do, but their impulse is not to collapse and not to retreat. Their impulse is to go forward. The folks who retreat and collapse, they tend to withdraw into themselves a little bit more. The people who are anxious don't do that so much. They tend to go out. They tend to get involved in action. They want to do something. Staying still and slowing down makes things worse for them. What they need to do is keep moving. So there's a lot of kind of action-oriented behavior here. It's a circular kind of behavior. It doesn't necessarily lead to a resolution. It's kind of burning off steam, right? And then there's the folks who are angry and they get very judgy and aggressive in a situation like this, perhaps even bullying in a situation like this. The folks who are angry, they are justifiably upset about the complicated series of challenges we're now facing. And their impulse is to speak out. Their impulse is to try to wrangle this into a shape that will make them more comfortable. And it's not really possible to do that. You can't control the world. But for people for whom anger and control are their ways of feeling safe, this is a thing. This is the thing they will try to do. But again, all of these responses, retreat, depression, anxiety, and anger, these are normal responses. And they're in line with something we see in social services and in the general social conversation these days, which is that we should try not to stigmatize people too much who are struggling. We should try not to stigmatize people at all who are struggling with what are normal human responses to impossible situations. We're used to doing this with our clients and our residents. We're used to saying, you know, if you have a mental health challenge, that's okay. But what we tend to do with people who work in this field, we tend to say that you should be able to manage or control your mental health issues. You should be able to not have them overwhelm you. And that's not something we can say in this current situation, which is by definition an overwhelming situation. So again, look at these 4 cards and ask yourself, which one of these things do I do? Which one of these things is my habitual response? And then ask yourself, what do I see around me? What do I see among my colleagues or among my family members or among my friends? What kind of a blend of these things am I seeing? And if you're a person who is connected in the community or in your family to many people, you'll see many varieties of this sort of coping mechanism. And what's important is not to see it as a kind of random or inscrutable response to the situation. These are predictable, dependable responses that people will do. They come out of their early childhood development. They're part of their character. You could even say they're part of people's nature. Once they get old enough and these behaviors become more or less set, this is what people do. This is how people respond to stress. Now, the shadow side of this, or the downside of this, is that over time, if the stress continues past our ability to cope with it normally, to contain it, then what we get are the common health challenges. If you try to escape indefinitely into the imagination, into the spirit world, into a place where you feel safe, eventually you get far enough away from the world that bad things start to happen in your world. If you collapse long enough, everything kind of falls apart in your life. If you try to control and contain and just keep yourself busy to stay ahead of the stress, eventually the fatigue of that will catch up to you. And if you try to control a situation that's uncontrollable, eventually you'll crack and your relationships will crack. So let's look now at the shadow side of this. I've spoken a bit about resilience so far and how good we are at being resilient. But what happens when our resilience gets corroded? What happens when it goes on too long? What happens when the stress of the moment exceeds our capacity in a long-term way, which is what we're starting to see now? We're into this pandemic and its consequences for quite a while now, and for quite a while into the future. And so we don't really know exactly what's going to happen. But one of the things we do know is that there's going to be stress for a while. There are going to be stressful situations, and the situation will evolve and change. But we're not getting back to the prior normal anytime soon. So for all of us, the stress will just continue to evolve. And in my conversations with professionals lately, in nonprofit organizations primarily, what I'm hearing is that people are starting to notice this. They're starting to notice that their default system, which gets them through most challenging circumstances, their default system, escape, freeze, get anxious, or control it, this is starting to get frayed a bit. It's starting to feel like it's too much. So what do we do about that? Before we talk about what we do about it, let's talk about what happens when we lose the ability to manage it. 4 things happen. If our thing is to escape, then we can escape in a number of ways. We can escape into binge watching TV. We can escape into fantasy literature. romance novels, any number of things. But when stress lasts long enough, one of the things that you see is the search for coping that comes from the outside. And the most common means of that is addiction. So I'm going to mention addiction in each of the upcoming 4 cards. And again, I want you to be attentive to what it is that you do. If you use substances or behaviors that, broadly speaking, could be called addictive, what does that look like for you? What does it look like now? And are you at the point where that's a risk? So for folks who escape, the risk for them is that they get lost in the fantasy world. And fantasy gaming, online gaming, escapist reading, and so on, those things are very effective at getting people out of the world. As are hallucinogens. Hallucinogens just get you out of the world for a little period of time. They work. And they're a good illustration of the basic principle here, which is that when a situation exceeds our coping, and there's nothing we can do without outside help to get through, we'll look for outside help. And for many people, outside help means substance use. And the substances work. This is a really important point for me. The substance is effective at reducing the symptoms of the underlying stress. It's effective at taking the stress completely away. It works. It also wrecks your life in the long run, of course. But it's important to note that with substance use, it works in the moment. So for those who collapse, their tendency in a situation like this, which lasts longer than they can cope, is to get lost in things which freeze you down, which numb you out, right? Sleep is a popular one. Oversleeping, sleeping 12, 14, 16 hours a day, retreating into a bedroom space or a sleeping environment where you can just hide from the world. Or, of course, the use of opioids and cannabis, which are really popular and common in our world. People find that with this kind of substance, it just brings them down. It brings them to a place where they're okay, where they feel okay in the moment. Everything seems fine in the moment. So there's a kind of collapse that can happen here. For those people whose impulse is to contain, to try to stay ahead of it, the folks who are anxious, their tendency is to choose stimulants if they're going to choose an addictive pathway, or get involved in action media. So that's high intensity movie watching, high intensity gaming, that kind of thing, that kind of cycling around. One of the ways you can tell, by the way, that this might be your impulse, this might be your style, is if you start things but don't finish them. It's kind of a hallmark of the person who has hypervigilance, who's always trying to contain and who's a bit anxious. Those folks tend to start things. They start new projects. They start initiatives. They have a great new idea, and they tend not to finish things. So perhaps that's your thing. Perhaps you get stuck in a situation where you've started a bunch of new projects because you're at home more and you've got more time. And if you tend not to finish things, maybe that's part of this dynamic. It's the excitement of starting that makes this work. Or maybe your thing is anger and you want to control the situation. And if that's the case, what you're likely to do is start drinking more if you're a drinker. So alcohol is pervasive in our society. It's legal, of course. There's a lot more drinking than people recognize. And the rates of alcohol consumption have gone up, 40% or so during the pandemic. So we're already seeing a rapid rise in people's tendency or impulse to use alcohol to cope. And it's understandable because alcohol works. It works in the moment to make you feel that everything's okay, that you're in control, that you're safe, that you can manage it, that you can get through. It works. But we should also be thinking about the flip side, which is it works until it doesn't work. Alcohol works until it wrecks your life. wrecks your health. Just like with all the substances, the use of substances is a signal about what's underneath the using. Addiction is never really about the substance. It's really about the mental health and stress underneath that the using helps the person deal with. So again, kind of pull back a little bit and look at these 4 cards and ask yourself, are there any risk factors for me? Is there any way in which I might be sliding into a situation where I might be doing too much of one of these things? That my impulse, the ability to cope in this situation that the behavior gives me, am I doing it too much? Are my colleagues or my clients, my residents, am I seeing this in that group? So as we move forward, I'm going to talk about how we might get out of a situation where we get stuck in these coping patterns. But for now, I'm just going to pause and I'm going to ask people to reflect for a moment on what we've talked about so far, what I've talked about so far, where you see yourself, how you see this situation unfolding in your family, in your friends, in your colleagues, in your residents, your clients, how you see this as it blossoms and really fills so much of the attention of our society. So we're gonna have an opportunity to write some reflections down and then hopefully share them back and have a short discussion here before we move on to the next part, which is, okay, if we are stuck, what do we do about it? But before getting to that, I'm gonna pass the mic over to Kate, and we'll see what people have been thinking and writing down in the chat function.
So we have somebody saying that they are cycling between escape and collapse.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really common. Yeah, so when, if we kind of do a deep dive into the way the nervous system works and default coping works, we can start to see different things getting paired together. And escape and collapse often pair together, and contain and control often pair together as well. Yeah, I hear you. It's an effective impulse in the short run, right? There's a lot of binge watching going on and a lot of binge reading going on, so lots of escape. And then also binge watching until you fall asleep, and then sleeping for 12 hours if you can, with that lovely afterglow of binge watching a television show in your mind. Yes, it's definitely an interesting ongoing challenge for people.
Yeah, and a couple of people have mentioned that they tend to do more baking now. And overeating as well can be an issue. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, and the eating, baking, food, the sort of food universe is tends to be connected with the freeze response. And we talk about comfort food and food that is emotionally satisfying for us, and that tends to be associated with this impulse to kind of collapse and pull in. It's similar to the sleep impulse, yeah. And many people are rediscovering baking. So of course, it's a great example of the fact that there's an upside. The upside is that the act of combining ingredients and pursuing the craft of something like baking is valuable and important. And so it provides innumerable emotional benefits. And of course, the downside is you can bake 100 loaves of bread and eat them all. So it's a great example of how we have to be careful that these default impulsive coping mechanisms are effective. There's a reason we're drawn to them. They do work. And then we have to think about what's the right amount of work that we assign to them. What's the right amount of respite we get by using these systems? And then when does it become too much?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that leads to a comment that attendee was saying that they noticed that they're vacillating between two. So as one stops working, then they go to the other extreme, then they try and contain that one, and then they collapse and go back to the contain bucket. So it's kind of a, go back and forth strategy.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, if you kind of dig down again into the way the nervous system works, is the longer stress continues, And so when you go into your default mechanism, your default response pattern, if a long enough period of time goes by and it doesn't work, the greater likelihood there is that you'll flip to another one. So what that attendee is saying is totally consistent with the research. We tend to flip from one to the other when the one that we like, our impulsive, normal, habitual one is no longer working. The technical term for this is transmarginal stress. We just flip. And so, yeah, we're also seeing now a lot of flipping back and forth, trying to find one that will get us through. And of course, no single one will get us through. And so the flipping doesn't really work. I mean, it works in the moment. It makes us feel better in the moment, but it's not sustainable in the long run. And we'll talk about what is sustainable in a bit.
Mhm. Yeah, somebody else has posted a comment that they think sometimes we judge other people to make us feel like things are more under control and predictable.
It's a very effective, very ancient human mechanism, judging others, the Schadenfreude method. Yeah, it's very effective. And now people who are more on the contain and control end will tend to be more likely to do that. People on the collapse escape end tend to be less likely to do that. But yeah, I mean, if you want to control your situation, judging other people is a very effective way to do that, especially if you can put yourself at the top of the heap. Now, a ton of psychological research has shown that everybody does this. Everybody tries to put themselves at the pinnacle of human achievement. Everybody secretly feels that they're smarter than everybody else and better than everybody else. And so in a situation like this, that could be a very effective coping mechanism. You could feel like, I'm not like all those other idiots out there who are mismanaging this. I'm doing it properly. And I see and hear a lot of that. And it's a normal, basic human mechanism. If that's your thing, it's going to work for you in the short run to make you feel better. Absolutely. And I feel the urge to go back to what I said earlier, which is we shouldn't be super judgy about these normal human behaviors. This is how we get through stress. We shouldn't be saying we don't want to do any of these things, that these things are bad or wrong or maladaptive. These are the adaptive things. These are the things that do work. The only downside is if we let them run the show, then we get stuck. We get stuck in addiction typically. But they work. They're very effective.
Mhm. Somebody's asking, out of the 4 flight, freeze, orient, fight strategies, which or is one of them at the greatest risk for addictions? Is there any greater risk for one or all, or?
The risk for them all is the same, but the type of addiction is different. So if the fight response is your thing, it's not likely at all that you'll become addicted to hallucinogens or opioids. But if the flight response or the freeze response, so escape and collapse, is your thing, it's not super likely that you'll be addicted to stimulants. So the type of addiction that we're drawn to comes out of the nervous system. The nervous system is drawn to a certain thing. It's drawn to the thing that helps the default system work better or to last longer. So the type of addiction that people develop is not an accident. It comes out of the nervous system and the searching of the nervous system for something that works temporarily. So everybody is vulnerable to addiction. Everybody in society is vulnerable to addiction if the stress of their lives goes on long enough. So it's just a type of addiction that varies by nervous system, but everybody's subject to it.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of great feedback here, and people are sharing about their coping mechanisms. And I see, my coffee consumption has gone up. I'm playing
Mine
these.
too.
Yeah, me too. I'm playing these hardcore online gaming, software. So I think it's definitely speaking to what you're talking about in the discussion for sure.
Oh
Um,
yeah. I think it's really good to recognize it and even to be a bit playful about it if we can, right? I tend to be more in the contain, hypervigilant kind of end with my nervous system. And I notice, so that's coffee, folks. And I noticed my coffee consumption has, perhaps doubled in the last couple of months. and my impulse to start new projects has skyrocketed. So yeah, all of these, it's really important for us to notice these behaviors, and I'm really glad to hear that people are doing it. Just noticing the fact that we're searching for ways to cope, and we're finding them.
And somebody's asking, do you have any comments on how to balance different coping mechanisms in a family or a household?
Yeah, I will talk about that in a bit. But one of the things that's happening is families are spending more time together, and the tendency is for families to have two and sometimes three, not usually all four, but usually two or three different kinds of coping styles. So in a family of four, say, there's probably going to be two people who go one way and two people who go the other. And that's going to lead to friction over time as everyone's feeling stressed out. You know, if you have people who are on the kind of orienting and fighting end, so containing control in a family, and they're living, you know, cheek to jowl with people who are in the collapse escape end, the people in the collapse escape end are not going to want to talk about anything. They're going to want to go to their room and sleep the whole thing away. And the contain and control people are going to want to talk the thing to death and manage it, and to come up with a billion strategies to keep them busy the whole time. So these two systems are not going to be, you know, friendly together indefinitely. So yeah, normal family stress is part of it. And I think that our ability to talk about it, our ability to notice and to be attentive to the fact that people are trying, and a lot of what they're trying is unconscious. It's instinctive. It's coping that we've learned to do over the course of our lifetime, and we're just going to do it because it's the thing we do because we're us. I think our ability to notice people's different styles, especially in a family, is really important here, because there's some danger that family relationships might be damaged if people don't understand one another enough, if people aren't as clear as they might be about the fact that this is a unique situation, and we need to be a bit forgiving of some of the behavioral patterns that might otherwise be less evident in our families. People might be out in the community. We see it less. People are stressed out less in the past. And so now we would see it more. It's in our face more. And our own reactivity to it is going to be more. For example, the folks who get in the most difficulty here are the folks who are, one person's in the control area, the anger area, the fight area, and the other person's in the collapse area, the freeze area. These two default responses are kind of opposite, and they are likely to get into friction in a long-term situation where they can't get away from each other. This is going to be really tricky. The person who's on the control and anger end is going to get really angry at the person who's in the collapse and withdraw end, and that's a problem. Unless people recognize this is default coping. Everybody's trying. We need to be a bit forgiving of people's nature. People's nature is not wrong. People are not doing the wrong thing. They're doing what they know how to do. They're doing what their entire life story has taught them how to do. It's important to recognize that. Okay,
Mhm.
we're going to have some more opportunity for questions and further conversation as we move along, but I'm just kind of checking the clock, and I'm thinking, let's move on to the next part. Okay, Kate, you good to go?
Yep, good to go.
Oh, okay. So what do we do? What do we do to get through all of this, and how do we think about navigating it healthfully? What are the four healing pathways that flow out of these? For the person who escapes, how do we become more present? For the person who withdraws, how do they connect back with people? For the person who contains and gets super anxious and tries to manage it and keep ahead of it, how do you keep it contained without freaking out? And for the person who's angry about this and who's fighting back against this, how do you help direct that? It's not going to happen that you're not going to feel that, but how do you direct it so that you use it properly and you help yourself and other people through it? So let's look at what that might look like. So for the person who escapes, how do you become more present? How do you stay in your body? What are some of the things that work here? You can see a short list of them on the card: belonging, physical work, gardening, just being with people. The challenge for the person whose tendency to escape is that often the imaginal world, the world of the spirits, the world to which they escape is more appealing than the real world. It feels safer. So for those people, the challenge is always, how do I find safe people in the real world? How do I find a place of belonging? So for those folks, the best pathway is to do two things. One, be in your body. Do physical practices which help you be in your body. And I'll give some more examples later. And part two, to be connected to people, safe people, emotionally safe people who will help you stay in the real world, the world that we inhabit, this wonderful, magical world that we inhabit, that has all the gifts and wonders of the imaginal world, the world of the spirits, the other world to which you retreat. All this world here has all the same things. It's coming into it. That's the challenge. And the body is a good is a good pathway to get into the world and connecting with people. Even just one safe person can do it. For folks who are depressed and who've retreated and are withdrawn and are trying to sleep the whole thing through like Rip Van Winkle, connection and trust, connection to other people and to the feelings of other people, especially empathy. Empathy is a superpower. The ability to feel and inhabit and respond to the inner life of other people, nurturing other people, helping other people. And so this is where cooking and baking are real strengths. So if we're thinking about how we use baking appropriately and healthfully in this situation, it would be two things. It would be focusing on the act of baking as a skill and getting better at it, and then also sharing our baking with others safely, sharing our baking with our family members or our colleagues or whomever safely, so that the baking spreads beyond ourselves and it leads us out of the retreat that we've gone into, pulls us into connection with other people. For the folks who are anxious, how do you contain the anxiety? How do you encourage it just not to be free flowing inside of you? You know, anxiety is just free flowing emotional energy. It's just emotional energy that's not contained. It just runs around inside of you. It runs around inside your head, causing those racing thoughts all the time. It runs around inside of your body so that you're always on edge and can't sleep and can't settle down and can't stop moving. If you're a leg bouncer, you know who I mean. You know those folks who always have one leg bouncing. Look at your leg right now. Look at your right leg. Is it bouncing? Then that's your thing. Containment, anxiety, orienting response is your thing. The leg bouncers always have this as their default nervous system response. How do you slow it down? How do you feel safe so that you can be more mindful and be more present? Mindfulness practices, which are really popular right now, they're good for this. Mindfulness meditations, walking meditations. I'm a fan of practices which slow people down. And one of the best practices for slowing people down is stargazing. Going out at night during a period where when the air is pretty clear now. One of the unintended side effects or consequences of the current pandemic is that the air is a little clearer. So stargazing is better now. And we're entering a period of the year when you can go out stargazing without freezing to death. The next time that the air is clear and the sky is dark, go outside, do some stargazing. Connect with that experience of wonder and universality that stargazing brings. Now, of course, other things bring it too. You know, bird watching, just going for a walk in your neighborhood, just exposing yourself to the natural environment safely. All these things work. And the final one for the folks who are anxious is to finish something. The orienting tendency, the orienting style, the anxious style, that is almost always accompanied, as I said before, with unfinished projects. The leg bouncer has a garage filled with unfinished projects, has unfinished novels in a drawer somewhere. They have unfinished stuff. It's their hallmark. They just don't finish stuff. They have lots of enthusiasm, lots of energy, lots of anxious, let's go, let's get it done energy, but they don't finish stuff. It's the downside. So finish something. Choose a small project, something that is much smaller than the thing you want to do. Don't write a novel, write a short poem. Don't try to, use the period of the pandemic to learn how to run a marathon. Use the period of the pandemic to learn how to run around your block. Start slow, start modest, and slow down. And for the orienter, this is the hardest thing of all. Slowing down is just really hard. They don't like to slow down. Slowing down makes them anxious. It increases the anxiety. And so there's a kind of a skill with learning to contain better. It's slowing down to the point that you feel anxious about slowing down, and then staying in that anxious place of, I'm going slower. I don't like going slower. Staying with it for a few seconds or a few minutes so that you can do it. With all of the nervous system responses, progress forward or growth or self-growth or improvement always means learning to do more of the thing you don't do, learning to do more of the other ones, and learning to get better at the one you already do, learning to use it more appropriately. So I'll say more about that in a bit. But for the anxious person, slow it down. And for the person who's angry, it's easy to say to a person who's angry, you got to relax. But the last thing you want to say to a person who's angry is, you got to relax. You got to calm down. It doesn't go well. They don't like that. Relaxation and acceptance, going with the flow, it's not their thing. And so it's the thing they need to learn how to do. Being able to not just get angry, to notice the impulse for the anger and to contain it, to redirect it into something that's more healthful or more purposeful or more useful, rather than just cycling through anger again and again and again. And for the person who's angry and who has a fight response as their default, I said a little while ago that person's more likely to be in a position of authority or responsibility in professional life. And so for them, often a good redirection for their anger is toward mentorship of other people, toward helping other people navigate. Instead of getting mad at other people, which is instinctive for these folks, how can we help them? How can we help understand the situation of other people? Not everybody's doing the thing you do, which is to get angry and try to control it. Some people are just hyper anxious. Some people are really depressed and withdrawn, and some people are just trying to escape. So the person who's at this end, at the end of anger, this is the person with the most emotional energy for this situation. Their emotion is most available to them. The energy of that emotion is most available to them. They can use it more than the others can. It's right there. And so they should use it. They should use it to help other people. And the best way to help other people in a situation like this is through appropriate mentorship. So then look at all the 4 cards again and ask yourself, okay, based on the thing that I tend to do the most, or the thing that my colleagues or my residents or my clients do the most, is there something on this list that I should think about doing more of? Just make a note of it for yourself and for the conversation in a bit. So how would we direct these things? How would we build these skills? How would we move them toward a situation where we expand our capacity for the nervous system? Ideally, a person who is emotionally, spiritually, physically, whatever, healthy, who is balanced, is able to use any of the 4 responses and is able to choose when to retreat and let things play out, when to freeze and wait, when to orient and figure out in your head how to plan things, and when to fight back. Ideally, the idealized healthy person is able to choose. Very few of us are able to choose. Most of us, the vast majority of us, we just go on instinct. And so part of our personal growth, maybe the main part of our personal growth as humans, is to do 2 things. One, to think about and really understand what our default pattern is, and then to try to change it. And changing it is really hard. The best example, I think, or one of the best examples of how changing it is hard involves the person who's a sulker, a person who sulks. In an argument, when you don't win an argument, or when you feel an argument doesn't go well and you go off and sulk, if you're the kind of person who does that, you probably are really familiar with the dynamics of it. You probably really know what you do, and you can't stop yourself from doing it. Even when you know you do it, you can't stop. You just do it. You can see yourself doing it. You can even in the moment, as it's starting to happen, feel and notice yourself doing it. And even if you're trying to work on it, if you're trying not to be so sulky, it doesn't work. You just do it anyway. The nervous system takes over. So change here is not a matter of transformation. It's not a matter of suddenly deciding you're going to be a different person. It's a matter of really understanding and accepting this is what you do. And could you make incremental change? Could you make small change? If you're a sulker, could you reduce the amount of time that you sulk by 1%? Could you sulk for 1 minute less than you normally sulk before going back to the person you had the argument with? Just doing that, just making that small change is significant. So here we talk about small but significant changes in our ability to self-regulate. I haven't really used that term much so far today, but that's the technical term that people use when talking about the nervous system and making changes to the nervous system, self-regulation, the ability to regulate our impulses, the ability to build a gap between what our nervous system wants to do, what our instinct is to do, and what we actually do. So let's talk about what that looks like. What are some directions? What are 4 directions that we could think about pursuing for each of the 4 default stress responses? The first involves movement. For the person who's struggling to be embodied, staying in the body, right? Being physically present. Here are some examples on this card of some things that tend to work for those folks. Connection to the ocean is a big one. Ocean is this vast thing that's like an alternative universe. It provides all the same benefits as the imaginal worlds or the spirit worlds that people can sometimes want to inhabit. Being on the ocean, being near the ocean, going to the beach, those things. Embodiment practices like dance, connection to the physicality of the universe through practices like music, and being in groups of people. Now, the question of what kinds of groups we can be in is going to evolve as we move into phase 2 of our response to the pandemic. At the moment, we can't really safely interact with groups in the way that we used to. We need to preserve 2 meters distance. When we're not able to preserve 2 meters distance, we need to wear a mask or other protective mechanisms. So it's not really the kind of situation where we can just go join a group and be with people. But as we move through the summer, we're going to need to think this through and figure out how, as humans, we reconnect with people in groups. This is a fundamental feature of our species. It is a defining feature of our species. Going alone doesn't work for us. The most isolated people are the most at risk for a host of health issues and psychological issues and early death. So isolation is not a thing that we should be thinking about as being healthful for humans. We know this. Groups is how we thrive. So being involved in groups and carefully, safely inching toward a situation over the summertime so that we can start to be with groups is the pathway here, especially for the escapists. For the folks who are depressed and whose impulse is to withdraw. Getting into the forest. The forest is this very alive, connected, interesting place, full of wonders and full of connection. Animals, viewing animals online or interacting with animals who are our pets or whatever it is, right? Interacting with animals. Again, we have some restrictions around safety here, but connection with animals is often something that people who struggle with depression and the freeze response report as being deeply meaningful. Connection to animals. Learning a skill, a craft like baking. This is the 3rd time we've talked about baking. Baking is a craft. Woodworking is a craft. Playing a musical instrument is a craft, as well as an art. All these things are crafts as well as arts. And one of the ways that the person who is struggling with the freeze response, one of the things that works for them is to unfreeze by using your hands to work on something. Work in the garden, work on cooking and baking, work on building, making something. The hands are a real gift in our ability to build self-regulation. The work of hands is a deep, ancient power for humans. And so the work of hands tends to bring us out of ourselves, bring us out of our shell, and help us connect with ourselves and with other people. And creativity, of course, for the folks who are anxious. I was talking about writing poems instead of novels a little while ago. For the person who's anxious, do some creativity. Go into the mountains when it becomes safe to do so. Folks who are anxious love the mountains. And think about how you might use your creativity through storytelling or play or working on yourself, whatever that looks like for you. Don't let the anxiety just cycle indefinitely. Direct it into some kind of activity or project that you can complete. You have to be able to complete it. The worst thing for the person who's anxious is to have yet another unfinished project. So choose a small project. Choose something you can build in your garage in a day, or choose a small hike through the forest, not, climbing a big mountain on your first day out. Choose a small run around the block instead of a marathon. But choose something that's creative. A lot of people who are deeply creative have a lot of anxiety, and that's the reason. It's their default nervous system response. It's not that the other folks are less creative, it's that it just comes out in this endless cycling. And the people who are angry, who are trying to control and contain all this. I was speaking about mentorship a little while ago and the importance of building relationships in the community among our colleagues, among our residents and our clients. So these are the people in the best position to do that. How do you direct all that angry energy that you have into the community in a healthful way? How do you connect to your culture? How do you help build cultural relationships that have been damaged by the pandemic? The people who have the fight response, who are angry, they have endless capacity. They can keep going and keep going and keep going. They never burn out. Even when they say, I feel burned out, they're not really burned out. The other folks, the folks who freeze and retreat, they burn out and they lose all of their emotional energy. But the folks who are angry, they don't. I mean, they don't usually. They tend to just keep going. They just return again. The anger is like a limitless well for them. They've been angry since they were 2, and they just keep going. And so they're really good at encouraging other people to keep going in a situation that's stressful. Just keep going. And so mentorship in a situation of a pandemic is largely about that. Let's just keep going. We're more resilient than we realize. We have more skills than we realize. We can support one another in a multitude of ways. Let's build the relationships rather than have them fall apart in this situation. The folks who have the fight response are in the best position to do that. And because they're often also in positions of authority and power, they're also organizationally in a good position to do that. So if we were to do all these things, if we were to recognize that we have normal responses and that the healthful expression of those normal responses is to be present to one another and to ourselves, and to make sure physically and emotionally and spiritually we keep moving, we keep remaining embodied or becoming embodied, and we move forward. And if we were to recognize that our ability to cope is largely connected to our ability to connect to ourselves and other people and to build relationships, that we can't go alone here. We can't just say, I'm going to retreat and hide in my castle in my house and pretend that everything is fine. It's not going to work, of course. We got to connect with people. And as we move into phase 2 and beyond in our pandemic responses in British Columbia, we're going to start to have greater opportunity to do that, to connect with people. And if we do these things, if we exert our normal responses and if we use them to cope, then we have the opportunity to build some skill. And right now, that skill is containing all the emotional energy that's cycling through all of us and is cycling through the world, and use our creativity to build coping strategies. One of the things that's happening for me in my work right now as a consultant for social service and nonprofit organizations is people are asking, how do we modify our program? What's safe for us to do? How could we modify this group or that activity that we would normally do and still keep it safe? So we're called upon right now to really use our creativity to figure out novel and interesting and engaging ways to navigate this situation. This is a new skill for us. And it calls upon us to really be focused and directed and to contain. So for those who are anxious, if you want to contain your anxiety and direct it towards some creative practice where you can think about evolving the program delivery in the organization you work with, or with your clients or whomever. And for the folks who are the controllers, who have the emotional energy and have the kind of fight response cycling around inside of them, they're in the best position to think about how we direct all of this toward health. What does health look like for us right now? How do we build capacity on our teams? How do we nurture the people who are feeling collapsed and withdrawn and depressed? How do we help direct the folks who are anxious into useful activity moving forward? How do we call back the people who've retreated into the imagination, who've run away, or who just want to escape the whole thing? How do we call them back with a sense of safety? How do we help them connect with us now and help them find a place and a place of belonging within our groups, our communities, our organizations? So that's a leadership question and a mentorship question of capacity and community building. And the folks with the fight response, as I've mentioned a few times, are in a good position for that. So if we pull back and we look at all four of these cards, these are the same four cards that I started with: normalcy, coping, skill, and health. Recognizing that we have built-in responses, normal, healthy responses, using them to cope and not letting them get out of hand so that they take over and we just do our default thing and nothing else. But instead, we redirect some of this energy into skill building with ourselves and with other people. If we do these three things, that will most likely lead us to an outcome that involves health for everyone, for our communities, for ourselves, for our families, for our clients, for our residents, for everyone, for the world, which is, for most of us, what we're always trying to do. Most of us who are in this field of social service work, social justice work, community work, this is why we're doing this. We're doing this to make incremental changes, and we know that the changes we make are largely incremental, and that's the only way to make wholesale change. It's also the only way to make wholesale change inside of ourselves. Slow, incremental changes. Noticing our default response patterns, using them to some extent, but also building in the others so that we're not just doing one thing. We're not just on one track the whole time. If we do all these things, we'll maximize the chances we have to get through this in a way that works for everyone. So now we have a little time for questions and comments and further reflections about this. And let's see what people are thinking.
Yeah, so somebody's asking, how can I learn to be more accepting of staff that are not capable of coming to work?
Yeah, I'm making a guess in my mind about the default nervous system response pattern of the questioner, which is either fight response or orienting response, because the judging of other people or worrying about other people is part of what they do, right? I'm not saying that person is necessarily judging other people, but the thinking about how do we wrangle people? How do we wrangle people in this situation? How do we get people to show up is something that is more likely to happen if orienting or fight response is your pattern. Yeah, how do we do that? Especially because the people who are not wanting to come to work tend to have either a freeze response or a flight response. It's a pretty deep system and it's very effective and it will keep people away. So this is complicated, of course, as all these things are. But I think a couple of steps might be taken, and maybe the questioner has already taken these steps, I don't know. But the one thing I would do is try to stay in touch. Try to reach out, stay in touch, not just via email, through personal connection. Have a call, hear the person's voice. If you can do a Zoom call or a webinar call or whatever, do that. You want to be able to see people. If you can go and physically be 2 meters away from the person and have a conversation, do that. If you can do it safely. But the person who needs to be called back, is not likely to be called back because the organization sends an email that says we want everybody to show up. It's probably not going to work that well for that person. And if it does work to bring them back, they're going to come back grudgingly. They need to be drawn back through safety. And that's going to require some conversation. They need to feel safe. And it might be a long road to help them feel safe. And they don't need to feel 100% safe. They need to feel safe enough. So when you go to the Capilano suspension bridge and you walk out across that swaying bridge, it doesn't feel safe, but it's safe enough. And that's why people love to do it. It's safe enough. So that's the tenor of that conversation with the person who doesn't want to come to work or doesn't feel safe coming to work is, how can we help you make this safe enough? Yes, we realize it doesn't feel safe. It doesn't feel completely safe for anyone. How do we make it safe enough so that we can do something? Could we do a small experiment? Could we do something where you show up a little bit? Could we do something where you meet us halfway? You know, I've been having a lot of conversations with people based on this exact question lately, and I've been finding myself saying the same phrase over and over again. Can we do something where we meet each other halfway? Could we do something? It's not helpful or healthful for us to just kind of let it go and say, we're not going to do anything. Let's find a way to meet each other halfway. We're probably not going to be able to get to a place where you feel 100% safe, because it's not possible for anybody to feel 100% safe. But I'm hoping we can get to a place where you feel safe enough to do something. What could we do? That type of conversation would be what I'd try.
Okay, somebody is asking how they could support their child who they believe fits into the escape category. His gaming has greatly increased and is causing friction in the family.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's interesting for me. My presentations are almost always for professionals. And the questions I get in presentations are almost always personal. And I love that. I think it's great. I think it's really important that people think about the relationship between their professional work and their personal life. And it's all very deeply interwoven and interconnected. Yeah, for kids, gaming is really going up. Binge watching is really going up. And I think what's important in families is to talk about the dynamics, to be able to have everybody in part of the conversation where we talk about, this is what we're seeing, and it's okay. It's okay for a while. It's okay for a bit to be doing what we're doing, and we need also to be cautious. We need to be cautious about practicing self-regulation. Now, starting around age 6 or 7, kids start to develop their self-regulation skills. And starting around age 9, 10, those self-regulation skills really become the main part of their development. And that carries them through all the way to the late 20s. So self-regulation is the main feature of the development of young people. And so they're always in this self-regulation space. And their self-regulation can't really develop fully until they're in their late 20s. And so they're always a bit kind of catching up with self-regulation. So we can't depend upon them to show or demonstrate good self-regulation or healthy, ideal self-regulation at any point all the way up until the late 20s. So we need to help them. We need to help them recognize 2 things. 1, that self-regulation is the challenge. And 2, they're going to have some capacity that they can build. So with regard to gaming and parents and the childhood home, I would just have some conversations about it, set some healthy boundaries. The parents need to model the boundaries, of course. We could divert this whole conversation here and spend the next 12 days talking about that, about the often jarring conflict between what parents do and what they expect kids to do. So if parents want kids to do less gaming or less binge watching, then the parents need to be able to put skin in that game and also do the same thing. You know, you could say every day as a family, we're going to leave our devices alone for an hour, and we're going to go out in the community and go for a safe walk. You could start with that. You could start with a half-hour walk. You could start with a 15-minute walk. But I think it's important to use that incremental progress measure. We're not going to suddenly go to ideal health instantly, especially with kids. We got to keep them in the conversation. We have to give them some hand in the conversation. It can't just be, you know, parents telling kids how it's going to be. you can use authority with your kids up to about age 9, age 10. You can sort of say, you know, my house, my rules with kids up to age 8, 9, 10. But beyond that, you can't really do that. You have to negotiate with them. They have a say. It's their house too. They have rights. They have a position. And beyond about age 12, you know, you have to work with them. You have to meet them halfway. And by the time they get to age 15, you know, you can't tell them what to do. They have to want to be in conversation with you about this. So this conversation largely depends on the age of the child, but all the way along, it's about having conversation and being clear and just recognizing the dynamic for what it is and having conversations about this pretty regularly. You know, in Canada, parents tend to have only a few minutes of conversation with their kids every day. A conversation that's not related to tasks, not related to chores, or not related to basic household management. Emotional conversations. Parents tend not to have, in Canada, a lot of emotional conversation with kids every day. And that's something we could do a bit more of in this pandemic situation. We could talk more about how kids feel and how they're doing, and without trying to fix it and solve it and give advice about it, but just to hear their perspective and just to recognize that they have strong feelings about this as well. That alone will help, just spending a little more time talking. Now, if your kids are 6 or 7 or 8, they'll sit down with you in the kitchen and they'll have a talk about feelings. But if kids are 9, 10, 11, 12, that's a little trickier if it's not something you normally do. And so you're better off in that circumstance, if your kids are a bit older, to have a conversation about feelings during a walk. Go for a walk where you're walking side by side and not head on, and then ask people how they feel and start there.
Right. Someone's commented that a lot of their clients who are very anxious struggle with alcohol, although many of them are staying more sober now than they have in the past. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, alcohol and anxiety sometimes go together, but not always. They're not a perfect fit. Alcohol can make some people more anxious, and it has for some people this effect where it will make you less anxious initially, but then you get more anxious because you worry about drinking, or you get hungover and then you're more anxious because you're hungover. So alcohol can have this kind of weird effect. Folks with anxiety will tend to get involved in high intensity gaming or intense video watching, or the use of stimulants of various kinds, caffeine at the safer end, and you know, crystal meth at the more dangerous end. But alcohol is not necessarily their first drug of choice. So it makes sense to me that people with anxiety might be drinking less. They might be doing other things more, but they might be drinking less. They might be one of the few segments of the population drinking less. So alcohol is an interesting substance. It can have a variety of effects on people depending on what they bring to it with their own nervous system. So for some people, it will, in this current situation, it will completely bring them into a place of safety and comfort. And that will work for an hour, you know, between 7 and 8 o'clock at night, say, it'll work. Beyond that, it stops working. Beyond that, the biochemical and neurological impact of it is more likely to pull you into freezing, where you pass out, or pull you into anger, where you start to shout and start to get aggressive in your drinking. So it tends to move people along the spectrum of the nervous system the more you use it. And so for people with anxiety, that's not necessarily going to work for them in the long run. So it doesn't surprise me that people with anxiety are drinking a bit less, or some people anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting for sure. Another person has commented that they worry that they're coping in ways that they don't usually do. They say they're usually flight or freeze, but these days they're more orient and fight, and they worry that one day they'll just crash and burn because of that.
Yeah, it's a risk for sure. I think it's a positive sign, frankly, the whole, just as a general comment. I think the more that we can notice the fact that we can use more than one system is good. It's great. It means that we have some capacity. We're not just stuck in one groove. That's awesome. But it's definitely the case that if retreat or collapse, so you know, dissociation or depression is your thing normally, and right now you notice yourself getting really anxious or angry, there's definitely a risk there that you would burn yourself out. The emotional energy just kind of cycles through and you would collapse back. And so this is a pattern that some people have. Some people with anxiety, this kind of cycling that some people do, where they get really hyper and they get really anxious. Well, they get hyper because they're anxious. And they go out in the world and they're really, really high energy, and then they just crash. And then they go into this deep depression and withdrawal. And then they kind of let themselves rest. And then the energy builds up again until they flip back into the anxiety. And so this cycling is a really common dynamic with the nervous system. I don't use a psychiatric model, but this is what is meant in the psychiatric model by the bipolar dynamic. So yeah, it's a common thing, and I think it's legitimate to be mindful of what's happening. I think it's a good thing if you notice yourself using more than one response. I think it's also important to think about, okay, let's make sure we keep it balanced. Let's sure when we use the other response, we don't let it get out of hand and become the only thing we do, because that's when the burnout risk happens. If we switch entirely from collapse to or from depression to anxiety, that's the risk. What we want to do is have it a little more balanced. So we can say, sometimes I'm going to let myself be a little more high energy and fight back a little bit more, but I'm not going to use that as my new method all the time. I'm going to make sure that I take time each day to slow down. Now that question, brings to mind for me the importance of the nervous system reset. So as people have studied the way that the nervous system works and our instinctive coping works over the last generation or so in psychology and biology and medicine, one of the things that we've found is that the human seems to have a default kind of stillness that is much sought after in our daily lives, that we seem to do well when we have moments of stillness. The technical term for this is the default mode, where a few minutes of stillness, 10 or 15 minutes of stillness, where we're not doing anything, we're not checking emails, we're not figuring stuff out in our minds, we're just still, we're just sitting on a bench looking at the trees, or we're just walking quietly around the neighborhood, or we're meditating, or we're just sitting in the kitchen sipping a cup of tea. These moments of stillness and quiet, they reset the nervous system so that we're not in any particular instinctive coping style. It brings us into the body, so it takes us out of retreat. It brings us out of freezing to be more present. It brings anxiety down so that we can be, in the world. And it stops us fighting and getting angry. It does work. Many people don't do this, and many people don't have the opportunity anymore in daily life to do this because we always have our phones, our devices, and every spare moment these days we're on our devices. It's become another kind of coping for us, another kind of anxious coping. And so most of us don't have moments of stillness and quiet. And so kind of one overall suggestion about all this stuff is if you can build that into your day, if you can build a couple of times, 2-3 times a day, once in the morning, once midday, and once before you go to bed. If you can fit in these default coping, these moments of stillness and default mode moments into your daily life, then you're going to notice and be able to reflect on how your nervous system is doing, and you'll really reduce the likelihood that you'll flip from depression into anxiety and just burn yourself out.
All right, well, I think we're getting close to the end, and I think we have time for one more question. I know that you've mentioned this before, but I think it bears repeating. Somebody's asked if it's normal to have more than one type of coping strategy. They recognize themselves in more than one category for sure.
Sure, that's pretty common. We all have all of them inside of us, and depending on the circumstances, we might do one or the other. Trauma is the teacher here. Trauma is the thing that tends to pull and push our nervous system responses around, depending on the type of trauma. So the more trauma you have, the more your nervous system's been impacted by those experiences, and depending on the type of trauma, might have pushed the system into different kinds of coping that will pop up in situations that you face. So yeah, there's all kinds of varieties of this.
Great, thanks for addressing that, Ross. I think the information is really valuable. It's really enlightening for everyone, and gotten a lot of feedback already on how much people are appreciating the information that you've given. Thanks again to everyone. Stay well and take care. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.